The title of our presentation is Fatigue Crack Growth, Residual Stresses versus Crack Closure. There is a great debate in literature about relative importance of residual stresses and crack closure on fatigue crack growth rate. There is a group of people saying that crack closure is able to explain different issues of fatigue crack growth rate. On the other hand, there is a group of researchers saying that residual stresses are more important than crack closure. In order to study the effect of residual stresses, we consider the Superblock 2020 load pattern. This is composed of 8 load blocks separated by overloads. Note that there is a difference between the first and second load block of the same type. In the first load block, the load increases from the minimum value of the overload, while in the second load block, there is a decrease from the maximum value of the overload. This slide presents experimental results obtained with the Superblock 2020 load pattern. The material studied was the 7075-6 aluminum alloy. The fractal surfaces shows that the second load block produces larger crack increments than the first one. Therefore, there is an influence of load sequence on fatigue crack growth rate. In order to explain the experimental trends, we developed a numerical model to predict fatigue crack growth rate based on cumulative plastic strain at crack tip. Note that this model includes the effects of material hardening, crack tip blunting, plasticity-induced crack closure, and partial crack closure. The objective is to explain the difference between the crack increments produced by the two load patterns represented below. A CT specimen with a width of 50 mm was studied. Only half of the specimen was modeled, considering adequate boundary conditions. The simulation was made with or without contact of crack flanks, which means that crack closure may be eliminated from the analysis. This is very interesting because permits the isolation of the effect of crack closure. This slide shows the finite element mesh which was used in the numerical analysis. The mesh was refined in the region of crack propagation, having in there elements with a size of 4 microns. Material study was the 2024 T351 aluminum alloy. The proper modeling of elastic plastic behavior is of major importance for the quality of numerical predictions. We considered von Mises yield criterion, Swift's law to model the isotropic hardening, and Lemaitre-Chaboch law to model kinematic hardening. The Superblock 2020 load pattern was modeled considering the loads presented in this table. The load block E represents the overload. Note that the loads are small because the specimen had a thickness of 0.1 mm in the numerical analysis. Different numbers of load cycles were considered as indicated in the table. The crack growth was made by node release. This release occurred when the cumulative plastic strain at crack tip reached a critical value. The picture on the right-hand side shows the progressive increase of plastic strain with load cycling. The critical value of cumulative plastic strain was calibrated using one experimental value of the ADN as illustrated on the left-hand side. A critical value of 110% was obtained for the 2024 T351 aluminum alloy. Now we present results obtained numerically. This picture shows predictions for D load blocks. The overloads are evident, corresponding to the largest values of the ADN. After the overloads, there is a significant difference between D1 and D2 load blocks. The ADN is constant for D1 and it decreases progressively for D2. This effect disappears when the contact of crack flanks is removed. Now we present similar results obtained for C and D load blocks. The ADN is higher for the load blocks, which could be expected because the load range is also higher. The comparison with the results of previous slide indicates that the introduction of C load blocks does not affect the ADN values obtained for D load blocks. In other words, the overloads are able to isolate the different load blocks. Once again, there is a great difference between C1 and C2 load blocks. The crack increments are 48 microns for C1 and 8 microns for the C2 load blocks under plane strain state. This picture shows the effect of load range on the difference produced by load blocks of type 1 and 2. The vertical axis plots the ratio between the crack increments of blocks 2 and 1, while the horizontal axis presents the ratio between the load range and the load range of the overloads. The increase of load range decreases the difference between load blocks 1 and 2 because the ratio of crack increments approaches 1. There is an interesting linear relation between the two ratios. Besides, the comparison with experimental results obtained by Sand shows an interesting agreement which reinforces the robustness of the numerical approach. In order to understand the mechanisms behind the trends observed, the crack closure level was measured at the first node behind crack tip. This picture plots the ADN and corresponding U star, which is the percentage of load cycle during which the crack is closed. That is a perfect match. In the first load block, B1, there is no crack closure, therefore the ADN is nearly constant. On the other hand, in the second load block, the decrease of the ADN is explained by the increase of crack closure level, which reaches 20%. The residual stresses at minimum load were also measured at the beginning and at the end of the load blocks. At the beginning of load blocks, the residual stresses are different, being similar at the end of the load blocks. Therefore, these residual stresses cannot explain the difference between B1 and B2 load blocks because at the beginning of crack growth, the residual stresses are different, but the ADN values are similar. The opposite happens at the end of the load blocks. This slide presents the crack profiles immediately before and after the overloads. The overloads produces crack tip blunting, which eliminate crack closure. Before the overloads, we can see the contact of crack flanks. The region in contact is that corresponding to the last load block. And now the conclusions. The Superblock 2020 was used to study the relative importance of crack closure and residual stresses. A finite element model was developed to simulate fatigue crack growth based on cumulative plastic strain at crack tip. The prediction showed cyclic sequence sensitivity, which increased with the decrease of load range. Crack closure explained this trend. On the other hand, residual stresses were not able to do that. A good agreement was found with experimental results, which showed the robustness of the numerical approach.